Good morning, everyone. Once again, welcome back to our summer school in Brazilian studies. This is our sixth day, right? And we hope you are all enjoying so much. We've been learning so much together, and I'm sure you have too. And today we are going to have Professor Corinne Davis. She's going to be giving us some highlights on Brazilian society. Welcome, Professor. Can you hear us?
Yes, good morning. Hello, everyone.
Excellent. So I will pass the floor to you, and I hope we have a delightful morning. Thank you so much for coming. It's an honor for us to have you here, Professor.
Thank you.
Once again, right?
Once again. Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad that you could join me. And this is my third time teaching for the Brazilian Summer School. And there. And I'd like to say that this is a very different format than what I am used to. So I just ask for your patience a little bit so that we can do the best possible. And let's see, there we go. So I am going to talk about Brazilian society, which is a very broad topic. And one of the things that I wanted to do a little bit differently this year than last year was to try and focus a little bit on some of the things that are happening now, what I would call the two great big elephants in the room, which of course is the pandemic, and also the situation of police violence. And so you have another class that'll be focused on race. So I'm not going to go into as many pieces about race, but I thought I would bring up some of the characteristics of Brazilian society and touch on those two things just a little bit. And so when I was first given this task about 3 years ago, about talking about Brazilian society for the Brazil Summer School, I decided to start with the basics. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of demographic detail about who the Brazilians are, what is the composition of Brazilian society. And then I'm going to go into a little bit about how that composition plays out in terms of social structure in society. So what does Brazilian society look like? So what is the composition of age and sex in society? So the current population, estimated population, because we don't have the 2020 census data back yet, is 211,774,184 people. And that's the estimate pre-2020 census. And we're pretty evenly split between men and women, with a slight percentage more women than men. But one of the things that I wanted to look at in terms of society is look at what is the age structure. So this is what's called in demography an age pyramid. And so what the age pyramid does is it stacks up the population by age, and it gives you sort of a sense of in what age groups are the bulk of the residents of a certain country. And so here we have an age pyramid, and it shows you what are the changes from 2012, which is the light blue, to 2019, last year, which is the dark blue. And what you can see is that our pyramid is starting to get fatter towards the top. And this is a common process that happens through most societies, what's called the aging of society. And so traditionally, Latin American countries have had larger percentages of their population in the lower age brackets. And what we've seen over time is that just like the process that happened in Europe and just like the process in the United States and in Canada, we see in Brazil an aging of society, what we call a demographic transition. And so what does this look like? So here you can really see how the pyramid has changed over time. And so if you look at the first pyramid, this is 1975, and you can see that the larger percentage of the Brazilian population was very young, below 30 years old. And then as we go on, we have the year 2000 based on the 2000 census. And you can see that it's beginning to look a little bit more like the first one that I showed you. And then the prediction for 2025 looks very similar to this sort of smushed pyramid that we have. And then the estimation by 2050 is that we will really see an aging of the population. Why is it important to know the age composition of any society? Well, the larger percentage of the population is going to be taking a larger percentage of the public goods of a society. So if we have a society that is very young, then public good needs to be focused and public expenditure needs to be focused more on education. And if we have an aging society, a society that's much older, then that means that we need to be focusing more on the public goods based in retirement saving and retirement payments, and also in healthcare. So why did Brazil go from 1975 and having a very, very young population to having a more aged population? So the first thing that happened in the demographic transition in Brazil is that we had significant decreases in infant mortality. So the first stage of any demographic transition, and if we look at the European case or the North American case, this happens close to the Industrial Revolution and post-Industrial Revolution, that with advances in infrastructure and advances in medicine, you have fewer infant deaths. And so initially you have a very young population because the children are surviving, but these medical advances haven't gone to the point where people are staying alive for many more years. So in the beginning, and so in the 1960s and the 1970s, you saw that we still had a lot of children being born, fewer dying, but we still didn't have a lot of people surviving and having a long life expectancy. What started to happen in the 1970s and the 1980s in Brazil was that you had a very severe drop in fertility rates. And so the birth rate, so the number of children on average that a woman would have in 1960 was 6.3, which is a lot. And then you can see how in 2010, that breaks down and reduces to 1.9. And what's interesting in the Brazilian case is that this drop in fertility rates happened in a very short period of time. And that was a direct response to a couple things. First of all, you had an expanse in the education system. And so many more women were delaying childbirth and going into school, staying in school longer. And we know that the more schooling that a woman has, the later she has her first child. And the later she has her first child is going to determine how many children she has. The other thing was that there was a very strong public policy towards access to birth control and even access to sterilization. And there's some discussion about that. There's a very interesting study, anthropological study called Death Without Weeping, that looks at some of the impacts of sterilization and some of the impacts of infant mortality in the Northeast in the 1970s and 1980s. And so then the curve, so that's why we see such a difference in the curve happening from 1975, and in only 20 5 years to 2000, you see that really the percentage of children that make up the population goes substantially down. So in addition to the fact that we have more women in the workforce, we have higher rates of female education. So women are having their first child later, and because of that, they're having fewer children. Then that also combines with advances in infrastructure, advances in medicine, and then you see the life expectancy in Brazil increase substantially. So in 1960, the average life expectancy in Brazil was only 48 years old. And in 2004, it has now gone up to 75.4 years. So the life expectancy increases due to better infrastructure, better schooling, and advances in medicine. And so all of those things together, forces that limit the amount of children, therefore making the bottom of the pyramid smaller, and advances that allow for more people to get older, has pushed the part of the pyramid, the top of the pyramid, to expand, to be larger. So all of those things bring into question, how does that affect public health, and how does that affect some of the things that we're seeing now? We all know that during the pandemic, there is a greater risk for people who are over 65. And so now Brazil has a substantial population of people over 65. One of the interesting things about Brazil, though, is that we are actually seeing more cases of people in their between 30 and 50 than had happened in, say, Italy or Spain. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the structural issues and where Brazilians live and in what sort of conditions that they live. And that brings us into expanding a little bit on why the pandemic has hit so hard in Brazil. So where do Brazilians live? So I want to talk a little bit about population density. So how many people live in a particular area, and what have been the migration patterns. And one of the most interesting things is Brazil went from being an almost entirely rural country to an almost entirely urban country in a span of about 50 years. So I'm going to look at some of the migration patterns, what happened up to 1970, why this happened, what have the migration patterns been from 1970 to 1990, and what are the current migration patterns. So this is a map of Brazil that looks at the different regions. And as you can see, the light green is the North region that has the Amazons and Pará and Tocantins and Amapá. The Northeast is the orange region, and that has Bahia and Ceará. The light beige is what we call the center west region, and that's where the capital city, Brasilia, is, Mato Grosso. The light blue is the southeast, and that's where we are. So Minas Gerais, Belo Horizonte. It also has Rio, São Paulo, and Espírito Santo. And then the pink is the south. The first wave of migration that has happened was a result of the ambitious policies for industrialization that happened in the 1950s and 1960s. And what that did was create a lot of factories and a lot of industrial complex, specifically in São Paulo, but in the southeast as a whole. So Rio, São Paulo, a little bit in Minas. And that spurred a migration from the north and the northeast of people leaving the rural areas of those regions and coming to the southeast and the south for industrial level jobs. And then as more people came to São Paulo and to Rio, there was need for civil construction and building and so forth. And so the very first wave of migration that we have is primarily a loss of people from the Northeast and some in the North, and moving to the southern part of the country. So this gives you a sense of the rapid transition between Brazil being a rural country and Brazil being a urban country. And so you can see, even as late as 1980, you had only slightly more than 30% of the total population living in an area. You had up to 30%, a little over 30% living in a rural area, and just under 70% living in a urban area. And you can see, and so that was after this first migration, this first major migration in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, where people came into the cities. So that's after even that first wave of migration. You still had about a little over 30% living in rural areas and a little less than 70%. And you can see how that's even expanded over the past 30 years. And we've gone from a country that had a little over 30% of the population in rural areas to a little over 10% in rural areas. And now we have almost 90% of all of the Brazilian population living in urban areas. So this gives you a sense, even after that first wave of migration, you still had a disbursement of people coming from rural areas to urban areas. And if you go back even further, say to 1960, you'll see that you had a situation where the rural population was over 50% and the urban population was under 50%. And you can see how that has completely switched. So this graph shows a little bit of which regions of the country lost population and which regions of the country gained population in the different waves of migration. And so the first one is 1960, 1970, and then the next bar is 1970 to 1980, and the next bar is 1981 to 1991. And then the next one is 1990 to 2000, and then 2000 to 2010. If you're asking me why the numbers in the middle are off, basically what we're trying to do is look from census data to census data. And in 1990, the president at the time decided that the census was not a useful expenditure of public funds, and he canceled the census. There was a huge, big uproar, and then the census was reinstated in 1991. So if you study any Brazilian data and you look at the census, you're going to have 1960, 1970, 1980, 1991. 2000, 2010, and now 2020, fingers crossed if we can actually get all the data today, this year. So just a funny aside at how when we as social scientists want to look at data, we really have to remember that the data that we look at, the numbers came from somewhere. The numbers actually represent real people, real situations, and we also have to look at how they're collected. So it's always kind of a funny aside to think about it, of how, why we have this little blip. But just so you know, that's why that middle number is 1991. So this is basically looking at population data from the census for each region to see who won and who lost, or who gained and who lost population. Through the decades. And so you can see, if you look at the first number, you can see that in the beginning, you can see the Northeast, which is the second column, they have had people leaving that region and going to other regions in each of these time periods. So the Northeast has always been a provider of immigrants to other regions in Brazil. And the North and the Southeast have always gained people. And what's interesting is that you see in the North that the original migration from the Northeast to the North was much less. And then the North became an issue with some of the farming, some of the extraction that was used there. The Southeast has always gained population. So the Southeast has always been a destination. What's interesting is when you break out the Southeast, you see that Sao Paulo has always had a net gain. People have always gone to Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo has always received migrants all through each time. Although the highest receipt was during the migration of 1970, 1980. And then Minas Gerais in the Southeast, you can see that Minas Gerais has almost always sent people, especially in those first waves of migration, because Minas Gerais initially did not have the high urbanization centers or the high industrialization, the high industry centers that Sao Paulo and Rio did. In fact, when I moved here to Minas in 2003, there was sort of a running joke that there weren't enough men in Minas to date, and that there were 7 men, you know, to so many women, because, or there were 7 women to men, because the men would go to Sao Paulo and Rio and so forth, and they would work, and all the women would stay in Minas. And so that the joke was that it was very hard to get married in Minas to find a boyfriend, because there was a shortage of men. And so I always heard this wives' tale, and I was like, it can't be true. And then you look at the data and you see, no, really, that there was a migration issue. If you look at the South has, they gained some migration in the very beginning, those first waves of migration where everybody was coming in because of industrialization. But since then, they have had negative, with the exception of this very last wave where people have come to the South. And then, just as an example, one of the states in the South, you can see that Paraná in the South, which is where Curitiba is the capital of Paraná, they had their largest wave of net migration in the very beginning in 1960, 1970, but then since then, they haven't been a strong set. And then the Center West, you see, has also gained population. And you can see the large spike 1960, 1970. Brasilia was founded in 1963, so therefore, or was founded in that decade. And so therefore, there was a lot, you can see that the large spike in migration could have been, and most probably was, pushed initially by the creation of Brasilia, and then, you know, all of the necessities that go around that, and the development of that region. So this gives you sort of a sense of the ebb and flow of where people are going. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what happens inside specific cities. So we talked about some of the fluctuations in the migration patterns that happen in different regions. But one of the things that is so critical to urban life today is, what is the population density inside the city? You know, we are not, as people, equally distributed amongst all of the urban space. And then how are city services distributed? And one of the characteristics, or some of the characteristics, of Brazilian urbanization is that, unlike the models that explain urbanization in the United States, for example, and some of the models that help to explain urbanization in Europe, you don't have absolute areas. You know, for example, the most common model, or the beginning model in the United States, is a model of ecological growth. And so you have concentric circles. And so you have the center of the city tends to be the place where immigrants and people go first, and then they develop, and they're there because they're closer to city services, because they're closer to their work, and then, but it's very dense, and it's very noisy because there's mixed land use, because there's commercial and industrial and residential. And so as soon as people are able to, they tend to move out of the city. And so you have these concentric circles where people that live in the suburbs tend to have better city services, better quality of life, more space. And the Brazilian urbanization pattern, which follows the Latin American urbanization pattern, is exactly the opposite of that. It was being close to the city center, being close to where the finances were, where the hub of culture was, and the arts, that was so important. And that was where all of the investment in city services happened. And so the poor either found small plots of land along that, or they developed their housing situation on the periphery of that. And you can see that very clearly if you've ever looked at a map of Belo Horizonte. Belo Horizonte is an interesting city because it was the first planned city in Brazil. And the very center of the city has a thoroughfare of a highway that circles it. And originally it was thought that that was going to be the whole city. And so if you look at how the streets are planned out in that thoroughfare, there are perpendicular lines. It's very well thought out. The avenues are very wide. But that is now maybe 1/10 of the size of the city. And so all of the rest of the city that's grown around it has grown in a much more organic and less planned way. So one of the things that's very interesting about urbanization in Brazil is rather than having large swaths of homogeneous spaces in the city. So for example, all of the, all of the rich live in one part of town, and then contiguous to the rich neighborhoods are some middle-class neighborhoods, and then you have to go further out into town or further in, and then you find the poor neighborhood. In Brazilian cities, you will find that those areas, those neighborhoods that have the starkest differences between income levels and infrastructure, a lot of times are not very geographically distant. And that has to do with the fact that just like in the ecological models that explain a lot of the urbanization in the United States, people want to be close to the demand of their jobs. And so if all of the rich are in the city center because they want to be close to the finances and they want to be close to government and the arts and culture and so forth, all of the domestic service that deals with that has to also be somewhat close. And also, since all of the investment in bus lines and water lines and electricity and so forth happens in the city center, then you're going to find that there are going to be self-help housing or self-grown housing that happens contiguous to these rich areas. That doesn't and you see that very strikingly in cities like Rio de Janeiro. You see that strikingly in some cases in Belo Horizonte, and you see that a little bit in São Paulo, although in São Paulo, much more of the poor neighborhoods were pushed to the periphery. So this is an example of what I'm talking, and so what ends up happening is that you will have some regions that are very dense, because in a very small geographic space, you have a lot of people living in housing that is self-help or constructed without city guidelines, right up next to or as close as possible to some of these other design cities. And so, for example, in Belo Horizonte, you'll have situations where you have very well designed with good infrastructure areas right next to areas that have grown up alongside of them in a very organic way. So just to give you some sort of sense, Belo Horizonte itself is very dense. And so there are there are 7,380 inhabitants per kilometer, but that is varied depending on where you live in the city. So for example, Pampulha, which is where the university is, and I live in a neighborhood that's in that region, has the lowest density. So we only have 4,859 people per square kilometer. Whereas if you look at Venda Nova, which is in the north, and here I have the map that shows you the different regions of the city, it's heavily dense. So you have 9,261. And then if you look at some of the other places that are dense, so you have the Northeast and you have the West. And so all of these areas are periphery areas to the center city. So the very beginning of Belo Horizonte was the center south, and the center south is also one of the more populated areas. So you can see that depending on where you live in Belo Horizonte, you're going to be more closely, you're going to have housing that's much more close to other people. And so that's one of the other factors. And so why did I want to bring this in, talking about the structure of cities and the density of cities? Because I really wanted to give you a sense of what are some of the challenges that we have in Brazil based on structure and based on where people live. And so one of the first challenges that we have in terms of public health is the fact that we have very high density cities, and then we have areas of the cities that are much more densely populated. And then the other issue that we have, and this is the picture that I wanted to show you, this is the divider between the neighborhood of Santa Lúcia and the aglomerado Santa Lúcia. So, so this is what's called the Barragem Santa Lúcia, which is where the lake is. And what I like about this photo is that it really shows the fact that you have very different urban structures almost contiguous to each other. So you can see the top part of the picture is a wealthy neighborhood, and this wealthy neighborhood is full of high-rise apartments, and you can see how even though it's dense, there's rows of apartments, there's rows of houses, and so there is urban planning that happened in this neighborhood. And then on the other side of the lake, in the aglomerado, you have an area that was constructed in what we call, self-help housing, which means that people built the houses themselves in the space that they could find. And here what you also have verticalization, but rather than it being high-rise apartments, you can see in the bottom of the picture how these structures are have multi-stories, so 2 or 3 stories. And just like in a high-rise apartment, where each floor has a certain number of apartments, each of the floors of these multi-floor, structures also is one family per. So it's basically, if you have a 3-story structure, each story is its own individual house, so independent living. But you can also see how there's a lot less space, and you have a lot more structures in those spaces. And so what this brings up are 2 of the challenges that we've had in Brazil. One is the idea of very dense cities, and particularly these areas that are more dense. You have in a smaller geographical area more people, which means you have more people per household. And so all of the recommendations of social distancing and isolation, once one's contaminated, those become very, very difficult. The other thing that this brings up is some of the cross-contamination that happened. The pandemic came to Brazil primarily from Europe, and it came because upper middle class and upper class people went on vacation, and they went to Europe because it came right around sort of the end of our summer vacation and beginning of Carnival. And for example, the very first death that happened in Rio de Janeiro was actually the maid of a family who had spent time in Italy, came back, had COVID, still had their maid come and work with gloves and a mask, they said. And she contracted the disease. And since she was in her late 50s and she had diabetes, she died from the disease. And so there's a sense of sort of how it spread. And we've seen that in Sao Paulo. In Sao Paulo, the neighborhood, there's a high income neighborhood that has the highest number of cases, but close to it is a low income neighborhood that has the highest number of deaths. So it's one of the challenges that we have in Brazil because of the way that we have our cities are structured, and the fact that we have a lot of interaction in terms of work situation between these areas that are contiguous. And then in addition to that, what I wanted to bring up in terms of urbanization, this is a map of Belo Horizonte again. And what this is measuring is something called the Quality of Life Index. And the Quality of Life Index is going to put together a bunch of markers in terms of healthcare, education, income, but also things like trash collection, running water, and also housing density. So how many people live in the house. And what you can see is that if you have better markers on all of these things, so better healthcare, higher average education levels, higher incomes, fewer people in each household, more access to health. So how many people have health insurance? How many people, what are the numbers of supermarkets and other things that people have available to them? You're going to have a higher number. And so the darker green areas in this map are the areas that are better in terms of the quality of life index. So they have a higher quality of life index. And you can see that the greener areas are towards the center. And also, let's see, I don't have a little marker guy. So 2006, so you can see actually that if you look at 2006 all the way through 2014, there's been some change, but the same areas tend to be the same, the areas that had high quality of income index or quality of life index in 2006 continue to have that. So for example, these two dark green spaces where this X is, they're the same two dark green spaces, and those are high income neighborhoods in the south of the city. And then you can see where the lake is. The lake is close to where the university is, and it's also another higher income area. And you can see how that continues to stay green all the way through. But you can see how the outer areas of the city continue to be light all the way through. And so there's a certain permanence or a certain stagnation or stasis of city structure that seems to persist through the years. And so all of those things in terms of density and where people live and what sort of services that they have inside cities, and I just focused on Belo Horizonte since that's where we are, give you another sense of how just composition, just where people are and how many people there are, how those bring up certain, how those have implications on social structure. Now I want to talk about what is the ethnic and racial composition of Brazil. So there are three main groups in Brazil. So we have Europeans, Africans, and indigenous people. And the Europeans, it's primarily Portuguese, but also we had migrations of French, of Dutch, of German, Italian, and Spanish through different cycles. So the Portuguese were the original colonizers of Brazil. But in the Northeast, you had French and Dutch colonization. So, French Guiana is contiguous to Brazil. And so you had, that was where French instrument. And then also in the Northeast, there was a Dutch colony that was then expelled. The Germans came to Brazil, not immediately after World War II, like all the movies say. But actually, when the larger German migrations were happening in the middle of the 1800s, so the same German migration that came to the United States, there was a strong German migration that came also to Brazil. The Italian and Spanish influence came mostly from the large wave of migration of Italians that came in the beginning of the 20th century. So the Italians that couldn't get into the United States or didn't go into Ellis Island, a lot of them came down either to Brazil or to Argentina. In addition to that, and then the African population came due to the slave trade, and Rio de Janeiro actually received more slaves, was a larger slave port during the slave trade than any of the ports in the United States or in the Caribbean. And most of the slave trade that came to Rio came from East Africa, because those were Portuguese colonies. So primarily Mozambique and Angola. And then the third major composition are indigenous peoples. And Brazil currently has more than 305 different ethnic groups, and they speak more than 270 languages. And those are distributed in different parts of Brazil. So all parts of Brazil have indigenous peoples. It's not only in the north. Those tribes have been able to maintain more of their culture, but we have a large indigenous population that actually lives in urban spaces, as well as in their own collectives. In addition to those main groups that I talked about, you also had other ethnic groups that migrated to Brazil. So you had a very large Japanese migration that happened from 1900 to 1960. You had an Arabic migration, especially from Lebanon, that came. We have Chinese migration, Korean, and then more recently, there have been other South Americans, especially Peruvians, but also Bolivians who have come. So Brazil, we have this idea of the Brazilian, that's a mix of those three, of Portuguese, indigenous, and African. But really, there are a lot of different ethnic groups that are part of Brazil. And in their own ways, they've made, there are certain things in Brazil that you wouldn't expect. So for example, one of the major snack foods that people will go to a snack bar and get in Brazil is an esfirra. And an esfirra is an Arab pastry. And so there are certain things that have become part of typical Brazilian daily life that come from all of these different influences. So the influences aren't only from the major ethnic groups. So how do we measure it? How do we talk about ethnic or racial composition in Brazil? So on the census, when they ask you about your composition, they don't split, they don't have a separate category for ethnicity and a separate category for race. The questions are, when they began asking about racial composition in the census in Brazil was 1972. And they said, they asked if you were white, black, mestiça, cabocla. So cabocla was a free Afro-Brazilian. But you have to remember that Brazil was the very last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. It was abolished in 1888. And then brown, black, which would be a slave population. And so those were the original categories. And then in 1940, they changed that categorization to white, black, and yellow. So what does yellow mean? Yellow refers to Asian populations. Yes, it's terrible, I know, but that's the word that is used. In 1960, they wanted to get a little bit more variation. And so we have white, black, brown, which would be someone who was of mixed white and Afro-Brazilian descendancy, and yellow. And then in 1991, again, 1991, because the census for 1990s was conducted in 1991, they added indigenous. So since 1991, we have these categories where you have 4 colors. One color really talks about an ethnicity, and then you have an ethnicity, so you have an indigenous. And those have been the terms that have been used. Now, Professor Cristiano is going to be giving you all a lecture specifically on race in Brazil. So he's going to probably go into a lot of how they came up with these terms, you know, how the categories have been portrayed. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Ever since these categories were decided, there have been many, many academics who are not happy with these terms. And so there's been a lot of discussion about, well, should we use different terms? So should we use the word negro instead of black? Because the word black, the words that are on the census in Brazil are like the crayon colors. So black is preto, which is the color black. Brown is pardo. And yellow is amarelo, like the yellow, the crayon color. And so there was a discussion about whether we should be using different terms. So maybe we should be using the word negro instead of preto, black. Maybe we should be using the word mulato instead of brown, pardo, because that was more close to what people actually called themselves. And there have been a series of studies, and I'm sure that Professor Cristiano will go into some of these studies, but the difficulty that we've had, or that Brazilian academics have had when they talk about race, is that nobody can come up with an adequate substitution. And there's a lot of difficulty of trying to figure out to get continuity with the data. And so there's a general consensus that nobody likes these terms, but there's no consensus about what the term should be going forward. And so that's been one of the things that's been a little difficult in academia, because we want to continue being able to study race and racial impact on different social behaviors and processes and structures. But at the same time, everyone is very well aware that these terms may not be the best to capture the richness and the nuance of race in Brazil. So this is the current racial composition in Brazil. So these are, the light blue is the census from 2000, and the pink is the orangey salmon color, I guess, is 2010. And so you can see that you have, in 2000, you had a majority of people who identified as white. And now in 2010, you have slightly under the majority. And then you have a smaller percentage that identify themselves as preto, black. And then a very small percentage say that they're yellow or of Asian, understood to be Asian. And then the brown population is the second largest category. So people who consider themselves a mix of white and black. And so if you were to add up for, say, 2010, if you were to add up the percent that say they're black and the percent that say that they're brown, you would see that Brazil is a majority minority country. Just like everything else, we don't have populations distributed equally. We don't have age distributed equally throughout Brazil. And so, of course, we're not going to have race distributed equally in Brazil. So this shows you what is the percentage of white, black, and brown, and yellow, and indigenous in the different regions of Brazil. And so you can see, for example, that the Northeast, The North has the highest percent. The Northeast has the highest percentage of brown. The North has the highest percentage of those who consider themselves Black. The South has the largest percentage of those that consider themselves white. And the Northeast has the higher percentage of those who consider themselves Indigenous. And you can also look to the Southeast and the Center East are where the very small stripe for yellow is slightly larger. So this gives you an idea as you move through different parts of the country, you're going to have different compositions of race. And so the North and the Northeast tend to be darker, have larger percentages of Black and brown people, and the South and the Southeast tend to have larger percentages of people who consider themselves, would self-identify as white. What about religion in Brazil? The census divides religion into 5 groups. So it says that when they ask you about religion in the census, you can say that you're Catholic, you can say that you're evangelical, you can say that you're espírita, you can say that you are adept at one of the African religions, you can say that you are a practicer of another religion, or you can say that you don't practice religion at all. And so evangelical is the term for any Protestant, and then espírita is a religion that's based on some of the Eastern teachings, like Buddhism and Hinduism, but although it's not those, but it's based on those. And then the African religions primarily are Candomblé, Umbanda, and then all of the other religions, which includes Judaism, Hare Krishna, Muslim, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. And so how does that divide up? What is the distribution? And so you can see here, this shows what is the percentages and how those have changed over time. So in 1960, you had less than 10% of the population was Protestant or evangelical. And then you had almost over 90% of the country was declared itself Catholic. And then all the other religions were a very, very, very small minority. And then what has happened over time, and this is true of most Latin American countries, is that the percentage of people who identify themselves as Catholic has dropped substantially. And the percentage of people who consider themselves Protestant evangelical has gone up. This is, so you've had a wave of evangelicalism happen in Brazil, just as you've had in many other Latin American countries. And so the 2010 census put people who said that they were Catholic down to almost 60%, and Protestant evangelicals are up to almost 20%. And you also see that people who say they don't have any religion at all has gone up. It was almost nothing in 1960, and now it's about 5-6%. And then other religions, so you see Spirita has grown up also and begun to have a slight amount of percentage. So there's 2 things that have happened over time that are characteristic of religion in Brazil. The first thing is what's called Pluralism Syncretism. So pluralism, so there have been multiple religions in Brazil, and people that believe multiple things. And this leads to syncretism. So people will, for example, be practicing Catholics, but they won't think twice about participating in the ritual of wearing white and throwing flowers into the sea on New Year's to celebrate Iemanjá, who is a god in the African religions. And then people who say that they're not practicing will be attent to certain rituals regarding certain saints and saints that could be beneficial to them. So, for example, Saint Anthony or other saints that they would practice a ritual, for example, putting it in the refrigerator or doing a certain thing or giving a certain prayer, even though they would say, oh, I'm not Catholic. And so there's a blending on syncretism of people who believe many, many different things and will blend different beliefs and rituals. And so there's and this happens much more with Catholics and others than with Protestants. The evangelicals tend to be less syncretists and less open to this blending than people who are who say identify as Catholic. The other thing, and this is what I alluded to in the graph, was the rise of evangelical religions. And most of these are not traditional Protestants. So it's, in the majority, it's not traditional Protestants like Presbyterian or Baptist or Methodist or so forth. Most of this has to do with Pentecostalism and Pentecostal religions. And so there's a strong rural and urban division. Many more Pentecostals live in urban areas than in rural areas. Rural areas are still more predominantly Catholic. And Pentecostals tend to be more heavily concentrated in the lower income stratas. And there's a lot of research on this looking at, the types of religious ceremonies and certain religious beliefs, and how that might tie into why people of lower income stratas seem to be much more drawn to the teachings of Pentecostal evangelicalism than Catholic religions or the Spiritists or Candomblé. And then you see the real rise of Pentecostalism in the 1980s and 1990s. And actually, I would say that we're at a point where politically, the Pentecostals and evangelicals are having a moment, in the sense that they have our current president considers himself evangelical and believes that those values and those dogmas should be part of his government. And so, for example, the brand new Minister of Education is an evangelical pastor. And there have been much more in the past 10, 15 years, more evangelicals entering politics. And the evangelicals have considered themselves a pretty substantial voting bloc. And so they are interested in certain public policies that have to do with education and family values, and they will vote accordingly. So beyond the rise of Pentecostalism as a religious force, what we've begun to see in the past, I would say about 15 years, is Pentecostalism really being a political force. And I would say that we are at a point right now politically where that's very, very evident. So I want to talk now a little bit about how all of this, religious composition, ethnic composition, age, regional distribution, city distribution, how that sort of sets the stage for social structure. And one of the main characteristics of Brazilian society is a very high degree of social inequality. And so, as I showed, Brazil is a highly stratified country with marked differences in development by region and by social groups. And so you can see that the Gini index, which is the relationship between the richest 20% and the poorest 20%. And the lower number you have, the better off you are, the more equal your society is, the less of a gap there is between the richest 20% and the poorest 20%. And the Gini index in 2001 was 55.3. It had gone down slightly in 2014 to 49.7, but it is edging back up, 53.3. And I'm sure because of the unemployment caused by the pandemic and because of some of the austerity measures, economic austerity measures that have begun to be put in place, I'm sure that our inequality measure is probably going to be going up. I don't have data for 2020 yet. So our comparison is to the world currently is 19. So just to give you a sense of how composition, ethnic composition, racial composition, and economic social structure are intertwined, I wanted to show you a couple maps that sort of illustrate sort of this intersection of inequality. And so the first map on the left is what is the white composition by census tract. So this is not just the city of Belo Horizonte. This is Belo Horizonte with the surrounding municipalities. So there's 27 in the metropolitan region. And so the areas that are red, so the red and the orange areas are the census tracts that have the highest percentage of white people. Now, it goes with saying that Belo Horizonte is a mostly brown city. We have a small amount of a Black population, people that identify as Black, only around 9%. And then we have 40+%, 40-50% that identify as brown. So you can see where the red and the orange is distributed. And then the second map is average income by census tract. And the orange and the red are the highest income, highest average income. And you can see it's not an absolute overlap, but the areas that are red, with one exception, down below, which is Nova Lima, most of the red areas on the left map are also red areas on the right side map. And so some of the issues are trying to figure out to what extent, what is the intersection between income and income inequality and race. And so there have been a lot of discussions, and I'm sure that Professor Cristiano is going to talk about this quite a lot, about racial inequality and what can we discern as something being discriminatory in terms of race or just being a race effect, and what is a class effect. And so there was a lot of discussion about whether or not the inequality that is present and has been consistently present in Brazilian society, is that an effect of race or is that an effect of class? And so in the 1930s, there was an understanding that Brazil was multiracial. It was a racial democracy, in the terms of Gilberto Freire and of Florestan Fernandes, and talking about the fact that Brazil is a racial democracy and that all the inequality has to do with class. And it's a class struggle, and we have to work on changing class opportunities and allowing people more social mobility. It wasn't until the 1950s that there began to be discussions of racial inequality, but there was no consensus about whether it was actual racial discrimination. It was like, oh, they're poor because they're Black. No, they're poor and they happen to be Black. So there's a discussion of, okay, maybe race has something to do with it, but I'm not going to say that race has everything to do with it. And in the 1970s, you begin to get new studies of racial discrimination, and then they're showing evidence of inequality in a number of areas. And they're like saying, look, people that have the same, people that, in the same area with, two parents, and then these people get to go to school more, and these people have higher levels of education. If you look at labor markets, people with the same amount of education, Black people earn less of a salary than people who are white. And all of these things try and control for the other issues that might be affecting social inequality. And that those cannot be attributed to class. And then in the 1980s and 90s, you really begin to get a strong body of research, and I'm sure that Professor Cristiano is going to focus a lot on this, that really show that there is an unequal insertion of Afro-Brazilians and brown, because depending on the analysis, they either looked only at Black or they look at Black and brown together. And that there's unequal insertion of Blacks in education and in the labor market. And so this social mobility can't happen. If social mobility happens because people have more school, if someone has equal opportunity to schooling, then if the jobs that pay the best are contingent on having higher levels of schooling, then if schooling is equal, then people have equal jobs. That's the meritocracy argument. And these studies really showed that no, Blacks don't have an equal opportunity in education, and henceforth don't have equal opportunities in the labor market. And then some studies even showed that even with a college degree, Blacks were earning less than whites. But what I wanted to end on was the other sort of elephant in the room, which has to do with how are Afro-Brazilians, or how is their inequalities in the criminal justice system. And this is not a new topic in Brazil. I don't think it's a new topic anywhere, but because after the death of George Floyd, I think it began to get a little bit more international attention. And so there was obviously a lot of uproar and a lot of discussion in the United States, but I think that spilled over. Most countries began to look once again at racial disparities and how the criminal justice, and specifically the police, might be the police in their treatment of different racial groups. And in Brazil, it was no different. So in Brazil, we once again had a discussion about something that has been an ongoing problem. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit and finish my discussion on this part because it happens to be the part of Brazilian society that I have studied the most. So what are the crime rates? Brazil has a terrible reputation of being a place with very, very high crime, and in particular, very, very high homicide rates. And so these are homicide rates for 2017. And you can see that it depends very much by what state you live in again. And if you look at, it is the North and the Northeast that have the highest levels of homicide rates. And it is the South and the Southeast that are having the lower, for the most part, the lower homicide rates. That wasn't always the case. In the 1990s, it was Rio and Sao Paulo that had the highest crime rates and the highest homicide rates by far. Rio de Janeiro is still no happy place to be. It has a homicide rate of 40 per 100,000. Minas, we're doing a little bit better. We're only at 19.6. Sao Paulo did there were a series of issues, and Sao Paulo has brought its homicide rate down substantially. And it is the lowest in Brazil. And that's a confluence of factors. Some people look at certain decisions that were made in policing. Other people look at the fact that the major drug trafficking gangs, there's only one primarily in Sao Paulo. And so that took over the territory. And so there was very much, you didn't have fighting factions, and that could be a factor. And so some academics have looked at different things. But I wanted to look at who are the who are the victims of homicide. And homicide is primarily primarily affects the young. And so if the rate of homicide in general in Brazil is only about 20 per 100,000, if you're a young person between 15 and 29, your rate of homicide is going to be much, much higher. And so the latest data in 2008 shows the homicide rate at 65.51 for people who are 15 to 29. And more germane to our point, Black Brazilians die from homicide at a much higher rate than non-Black Brazilians. And so this is a graph that shows the homicide rate. The blue line are homicide rates for Black, and that includes Black and brown. And then the red is non-Black, so that would be only white. And you can see that over time, from 2007 to 2017, the rate of homicide for white Brazilians has stayed pretty much the same over the whole country. Whereas in Brazil, it's grown. And you can see actually from 2015, 2017, it spiked up even more. So now the homicide rate is close to 45 per 100,000. And so then there are a lot of questions, well, why is that? And it has to do a lot with where the homicides occur and what is the racial composition of the places where the homicides occur. And so many of the homicides are occurring in areas of the cities where there are high concentrations of non-white people. And so they have a much higher chance of being victims of homicide. And I wanted to end with a discussion of policing and race. And this has actually come to the forefront, not just with George Floyd, but with some instances, very, very recent instances of our own, of police being caught on camera, just like in the case in the United States, of using excessive force. And so we had one case about a month or so ago of someone getting a very bad beating, and that beating was on tape. And then just recently, there was a taping of a Black woman who had been detained in Sao Paulo, and the police is stepping on her neck. And that was filmed. And so there has always been more policing in urban areas with larger concentrations of Black and brown residents. So in the areas where there have been high homicide rates, in the Southeast primarily, but not entirely because of the drug trafficking trade, there has been more policing in those areas. And the policing that happens in those areas is a type of policing that increases the chances of violent encounters. So occupations, either by the police with heavy artillery, using trucks and vans or jeeps that are heavily armored, or even military occupations. So in 2018, the Public Security Secretary of Rio turned over all of the public security to the Brazilian military, and the military occupied key neighborhoods. And of course, military occupation and police incursion with heavy artillery enters into a space where the police are using very potentially lethal tactics against in an area where they don't know the residents of that area. And so that increases the chance for lethal encounters. And so we can look at what has been police killing or lethal violence in Brazil. So in 2009, the police killed 6,160 people in the line of duty. And just as a countermeasure, because the US right now, the issue is exactly police brutality, the US number was only 933. And what's most striking about this number, over 2,000, almost 2,000 of that was only in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Has increased substantially over the past year or two. But over 70% of these killings were Black or brown people. And so I want to end our discussion a little bit on what is not very happy note, but sort of an amalgam of what is the issue, or where's the violence against Black people. A lot of activists in Brazil have begun using the term Black genocide to discuss how the police are treating the Afro-Brazilian population, and also what are the risks, the lethal risks in terms of violence for the Black population. And so out of 100 victims that are murdered, 75 of them are Black. And so, and then the data that I showed you between 2007 and 2017, you had an increase of 33.1% in Black victims, and then the non-Black victims only increased 3.3%. So that's that graph I showed you with the red and the blue line. And you saw how the red line barely changed, and you had a substantial increase in the Black line. Young Black victims are more susceptible to lethal violence than young whites. The odds of one young Black man to be murdered is 2.7 times larger than a young white male. Police homicides. So not only are the police involved in a lot of lethal violence, but the police are also recipients of a lot of lethal violence. And so of the police homicides, police are 34%, Afro-Brazilians or Black people make up about 34% of the police force in Brazil, and the police forces are state forces. However, they are a larger percentage of those police officers that are killed in the line of duty or murdered. So 51.7%. And then the situation that I showed you before, which is 75.4% of all the victims that were killed by the police in 2017 and 2018 were Black. And that doesn't just attend to Black men, Black women. 66% of female homicide victims were Black. Between 2007 and 2017, the homicide rate for Black women went up 29.9%, whereas the homicide rate for non-Black women only increased by 4.5%. So that breaks out that graph that I showed you by gender. 61% of female victims of femicide, and we have a category of homicide in Brazil that's called femicide, which is the person died only because they were a woman. So this would be a situation of, in most cases, domestic violence or rape, or death through an attack, and the attack was done because the person was female. So 61% of women victims of femicide were Black. And then with Black women also suffer more violence, suffer more sexual violence, and suffer more harassment. So this is sort of a screenshot that shows you in a series of details. This would be the argument for why a lot of activists in Brazil have begun to speak about Black genocide, that there are a series of things in Brazilian society that disadvantage Black people and make it so that they are more susceptible to violence in the society, whether it's through homicide, harassment, or even through police intervention. And then to go back a little bit to what we were talking about, the other elephant, which is the pandemic, we have new evidence that, just like in the United States case, non-white Brazilians are also having higher rates of infection and worse infections of COVID-19 than white Brazilians. And a lot of that has to do with some of the same issues in the United States that have to do with our higher incidences of comorbidities, less opportunity to social isolate, and because they are essential workers, more risk in being social worker and being essential workers, more risk in terms of living in more dense areas and in more dense households, and also to that in the extent that non-white Brazilians are also of lower income stratas, those people are more dependent on public health and do not have private health insurance, so they don't have access to beds in private hospitals. So, in conclusion, what I'd really like to put forth on a little bit more happy note is that Brazilian society is, is multiracial and multi-ethnic. There is a lot of variation based on region, based on city, and that the current composition of Brazilian society, you can't really understand it without understanding some of the historical and cultural antecedents, which you have been learning about in your different lectures on Brazilian history and Brazilian culture. And so the colonial period, slavery, the rapid industrialization that happened in the 1950s to the 1970s, and the impact on public policies. I didn't talk about this a lot. I'm sure that Professor Cristiano will talk about it. There have been a series of public policies, either through income measures through Bolsa Familia, or even through quota measures in the university system, that were diminishing a lot of the current inequality, income inequality, and also educational inequality. And it'll be interesting to see to what extent those gains continue, because a lot of those programs are being curtailed, either because of austerity measures or different political priorities of the government, or also because of the need to address the economic impact of the pandemic. So one of the things that's interesting, or one of the things that I'd like to conclude with, or as I'd like to conclude, is that the social structure and how a society deals with levels of inequality, levels of opportunity, expenditures in political capital or in public capital, really do depend on what the composition of society is and what the society as a whole decides are their priorities. And so that's why it's really important to go back and look at some of the demographics. What are the age? What is the distribution in terms of geography? What are the ethnic and religious compositions, and how do those impact how the society is structured? And that's obviously very, very evident and important in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Professor. That was such an insightful presentation and such an interesting topic, and so important for the understanding of Brazil and in general. And we have some very interesting questions. Mm-hmm. If you want to help us out here. So we have John Neal from Queen's University in Belfast. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the increase in urbanization has led to higher life expectancies? And another question about migration. Why is there a gender discrepancy in migration, assuming your explanation on the graphs? And what caused men to migrate than women? And also, this was he from South Korea. And then we have Hemelin from UFMG. What motivated the migration to Brazil in the 20th century? This is the first block.
Okay, so hold on a second. Let me just make sure. So can you repeat those just very quickly? So there was migration.
One's about migration. Why is there a gender discrepancy, and what motivated the migration to Brazil? And if urbanization has led to higher life expectancy.
Okay, gender discrimination, migration, and then migration in the 20th century. Okay, first of all, yes, in general, industrialization has increased life expectancy because with industrialization comes technological advance, and that advance has also included advances in public sanitation, and advances in medicine. And so in general, industrialization has increased life expectancy. Although if you have lots of people together that are not following practices of sanitation, that could be worse than living far apart in rural areas. But on the whole, as a whole, industrialization has increased life expectancy, not just in Brazil, but all over the world. In terms of the gender dynamic, it just had to do with the jobs. Especially in the first waves of migration, the jobs were all in factories or they were in civil construction. And so the typical pattern was the head of the family, the male head of the family went, established himself, and then brought his family. But primarily they would go. In the case of Minas, from what I understand, and I'm not a migration specialist, because of the proximity of the states, in Minas, the men could go and come back. And so it was much easier and much more cost efficient to go work all week and then come back. And then you wouldn't have to establish, you wouldn't have to bring your family. And so that's what I've understood about the migration in Minas, especially because it's only in the southeast. But migration from the northeast, it had to do mostly with what were the jobs that were available. And then migration in the 20th century, is that migration to Brazil or migration within Brazil?
Sorry, my microphone was off. Migration to Brazil.
All right, well, migration to Brazil was much more, well, in the case of Japanese migration, there was a concerted effort to recruit farm labor, especially because, remember, with the abolition of slavery, there was need for more workforce. And so in the specific case of Japanese migration, it was an agreement for Japanese to come to Sao Paulo and work as farm labor. In terms of Italian migration, that was much more a push factor than a pull factor. It wasn't that they were coming to Brazil, they were leaving Italy. Same thing with, and because of the financial and because of their economic situation in Italy. So a lot of the European migration that happened in the very beginning of the 20th century was much more a push factor than a pull factor. So Brazil wasn't attracting people as much as people wanted to leave Europe. And they came to the Western Hemisphere, and whenever there were restrictions or they weren't able to come to the United States, then they moved further south. And then Brazil, because again, Brazil was very interested in having more farm labor, and that Brazil was very receptive to immigration during this time.
Excellent. Now another block, interesting one. What really led to the drop in income inequality in Brazil in 2014? And that's from Aaron in the People's Friendship University. And Maria from Queen Mary University of London. She asks, what explains the rise of evangelicalism and Pentecostalism? And what is the general sentiment of the population about the increasing influence of religion on politics? That's the second block.
What is the general perception? No.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Of the population.
Population. Okay. The drop in income quality that was seen in 2014 has to do, or a lot of people, or many studies point to a group of public policies, primarily a group of public policies that had to do with wealth transfer called Bolsa Familia, where those that were most impoverished, that were below the poverty line, received a cash transfer from the Brazilian government monthly. And it depended on where you were in terms of below the poverty line. It also had to do with how many children you had, and there were rules about receiving it. So if you were receiving Bolsa Familia increases because of children, those children had to go to school, and so you had to present monthly an attendance sheet from the school saying, oh, my child went to school. If you were getting it and you were pregnant, then you had to show that you had gone to a certain number of prenatal visits. And so it was a conditioned wealth transfer, but it was different from, say, oh, I'm getting a credit to buy food. It was money, and people could spend it however they wanted to spend it. And what they found was that when you give extra money to people who are really poor, they spend it on very basic things. They spend it on food. They spend it on school supplies. Very, very rarely are they going out and drinking and smoking it or doing things with it. And so
I think
that was
especially because the cards were given to the mother, right? I think
exactly
that's important too.
exactly,
right?
and it's the same thing that, you know, and there have been wealth transfers done in India, for example, and they've learned that you give it to the female in charge of the household, and it ends up going to very basic things. And what it did was it allowed people who are in the very, very bottom achieve a certain level of subsistence. And then, of course, once they were working, you know, once they were working and able to earn a certain amount of money, then they basically phased out of Bolsa Familia. So that was one thing. The other thing that happened in 2000 to 2010, 2012 was there was an expansion of the federal university system, and there was an expansion of the loan and scholarship program for people to go to private university, because the university system in Brazil, the public university system is free, but it's very, very competitive. And so traditionally, only those who were able to pay for a high quality high school education had the knowledge and were competitive enough to pass the exams to get into free public college. And then those who went to public high schools and didn't get as good of an education ended up having, if they wanted to go to college, they would pay for college. And so what also happened in that decade was that there was a push first to expand loan programs and scholarship programs for private university. And then there was a huge expansion of the federal university system. And so that opened up a lot of new slots for people to go to public university. And then on top of that, there was instituted a quota system. And so people who had been public school students for most of their elementary and high school education, they had access to a larger percentage of the university spaces than people who had gone to private university. And then there was also a quota system for Afro-Brazilians. And so those things made a difference in terms, and there have been many studies that have shown that, you know, especially Bolsa Familia, but also the new access to university made a difference in terms of whether or not people could have social mobility. And when you have social mobility, so for example, if social mobility means that I have a better job than my dad did, so I've gone up in terms of what my income and my occupational status is. And so if I can do better than my father's generation, then I've moved up. And we begin to see that, you know, a lot of these things started to happen in 2003. Although I would say 2000, Bolsa Familia was begun in very small ways in Fernando Henrique Cardoso's presidency, but it really gathered strength and became a central political policy or central public policy in Lula's two terms, which was 2000, and he was elected in 2002 and in 2006. And then and then Jimma was elected in 2010, 2014. So you had a continuity of the same public policy, and that those things, because they're sort of grassroots things, they take a while. Bolsa Familia showed a more immediate impact, in just 4, 6, 8 years. The expansion of the university system took a little bit longer to see, and that began really in 2007 or 8, I think, about when those things began to happen. And then evangelicalism. Some academics talk about how liberation theology, which was a social justice wing of the Catholic faith, really failed in the 1970s for a lot of people, and that the Catholic Church, independent of liberation theology, which was a very small wing of the Catholic faith, was more and more aligned with establishment interests and less interested in the day-to-day life of the most poor. And there are a lot of elements of Pentecostalism about your direct relationship to God through the Bible, pushing of literacy, the whole idea of economic attainment or economic advancement through faith. And all of those things, some studies have argued that those have really appealed to lower income people. And so those are some of the things that have been mentioned in terms of why did evangelicalism, and especially not just any Protestantism, but Pentecostal and neo-Pentecostal evangelicalism, why did that really take hold? And some people look at, because Assembly of God came in the late 60s, early 70s, and then the Quadrangular Church was also around that time, and then Universal Church of God was a little bit later. And what all of those have really offered, and so then there's been a discussion what was happening in Brazil during that time. And what a lot of academics argue is that the disconnect and sort of not abandonment, but non-focus on the day-to-day challenges of the poor. The Catholic Church was not focusing on that. And so this allowed for these churches to really speak to the daily concerns of the poor. And there's a lot in the dogma of neo-Pentecostalism that was looked to be attractive. And some of the things very specifically, for example, in order for you to have a relationship of faith with God through the Bible, you have to read. And so a lot of neo-Pentecostals and evangelical movement really pushed literacy. And so that was seen as a big push as well, literacy and education. So that's what people have looked at in terms of its rise. The general perception of the population, the current president was not shy about his views of following a lot of the tenets and a lot of the dogmas a lot of the doctrine of the neo-Pentecostal churches in terms of very conservative family values, and he was elected by the majority. So that shows you that there is a perception in Brazil of that harkens back to very traditional conservative family values. So in Brazil, I think that there's a little bit of a culture war between a younger populace that has a more progressive take. For example, they are accepting of homosexuality, they're accepting of women's rights and women moving out of traditional gender roles. And there is a large part of the population that pushes back on that. And so I can't really say that one side is a higher percentage than the other, but it would be folly to discount and think that the political platforms that the evangelical leaders have put forth and those that have run for office have put forth don't have any traction in the society, because if they didn't, we'd have a different president. So there's definitely a significant part of the population that agrees with these values.
Yes, hard to understand, but yes. Okay, so another batch. Thank you, Professor. And this is interesting because you have mentioned the police, homicides against black people, and so these questions address that. Have any of the activisms led to any significant change in the approach of the police in Brazil? And what do you think are causes of the Black police homicides? And this is from Aaron from Russia. And then we have Cassie. Thank you very much.
Wait a minute, the second one was causes of homicide?
Yeah, why Black police homicides?
Black police homicide, or homicides that the police commit against Black
that
people?
was this is, I think,
homicide, or Black police getting killed, or
Black policemen
Black people
getting killed. I think maybe Aaron can clear us out, but I understood that. Why do Black policemen die more than white policemen? And then Cassie from King's College London. Thank you very much for the lecture, Professor. I wanted to know, what is the current government point of view on violence against Black people, and have they taken any measure? And then Licinia, she asked about the affirmative action, but I think you've addressed that already in the previous. So that was mine. I think you can.
Okay. Has any of the activism led to changes? Yes and no. There is no federal program that I would say that has really changed police activism. What I would say is that there were a couple of things. There was an anti-crime bill that was passed recently, and there was a lot of activism against parts of this bill. So, for example, there was a part of this bill that would expand the reasons, the justifications that police could use for using lethal force. So like emotional distress, fear, you know, and it could, and a lot of activists were very concerned, well, then there goes the farm. Then they can say in any moment, at any time, oh, well, you know, I was concerned, you know, this person was scaring me. Because there weren't any very specific things about, well, you know, it has to have it has to have a weapon. This person has to have a weapon pointed to you. They have to be running towards you, not away, et cetera, et cetera. It didn't have any of those things to really tie it in. And there was a lot of activism about not passing that piece of the legislation, and that piece of the legislation got changed. So I could say that some of the activism isn't to make changes, to put forth legislation that has led to a lot of changes, but there has been activism that is pushed back on the direction that some people want to go. There's a lot of activism currently against the governor of Rio because his rhetoric has been interpreted as something that incentivizes police to shoot first and ask questions later. And there's been a lot of public pushback on that. And so I haven't seen, you know, and so I would say that currently the activism isn't responsible for new legislation that would change police practices. I would say that the activism currently is pushing back on intentions to take away things that would make police accountable. And that activism, I see it working. Most recently, with the case and the Black woman in Sao Paulo, where the police officer stood on his neck or her neck, those police officers were put in administrative leave. And that's a new development, because usually what happens is they say, oh, they're going to study it, or it's going to go in a commission, or the human rights or the police oversight community or the police oversight agency is going to look at it to have in a matter of days that person put on administrative leave right away. I would say that that's a change. And so there was a push in different places to there have been some pushes over time for there to be more community policing, to have changes in the police, but none of those have really stuck. And it has to do with the fact that the police is really divided into two institutions. You have the civil police, which do all of the detective work and the investigation, and then you have the military police, which are not part of the armed forces. But they have a military armed forces mindset and hierarchy. And those are the ones that are doing the patrolling and the general public safety functions. And those two police organizations are state organizations. So police is not a city issue, it's a state issue. And then those two organizations don't really always work in tandem. And they have their own rules about accountability. So the police have always been a very hard nut to crack in Brazil. And so political activism, I think, has worked more to push back on abuses than to instigate new policies. Why are Black police, why they have a higher percentage of mortality or higher percentage of homicide?
Are they majority in the armed force, the Black policemen? Do you have
no, they're number? About 30% of the, however, they are probably more represented in the lower positions in the police force, and the lower positions in the police force are the ones that are more in the line of fire. So I would say that that's probably why they are more likely to die in service than others. For example, I'm assuming that data is more, I don't know whether they put the civil and the military police together. There's more non-white Brazilians in the military police than in the civil police, because the civil police, you need to have a university education to be a detective, whereas in the military police, you do not. You do not need a university degree. So I would assume that it has a lot more to do with what positions people of color occupy in the police than anything like, oh, they're going to go and shoot only people for racial reasons. And the last one, current government view. Oh, can't even read my own writing.
Happens.
Oh, violence against the Black, and have there been any measures? The current government doesn't see Black violence as an issue. They see violence as the issue. And so there are not any specific measures only to look at Black violence. The federal university, the current federal government would like to doesn't like this classification of Black violence and femicide. They want to look at violence as an integral and holistic problem, and they say that. So they're interested in measures that are going to stop violence in general. And the plans that have been put forth have been much more the idea that there should be stronger sentences, longer sentences, and that there should be more imprisonment. So they're looking at it much more in terms of a punishment and a sanction model than looking at it in terms of are there root sociological causes of violence that we can deal with, and that might change it. It's much more a control model than an education model.
Excellent. Very interesting. Okay, I think we have time for another. We have 2 minutes, but I think we can discuss. I think there's this question from Fadila in Indonesia, and she says we discussed the importance of understanding the age pyramid. If the majority of the population is younger, then we should focus on education. Would you say that Brazil has implemented this understanding of the age pyramid?
No. Traditionally, I would say that basic education, which is elementary up to high school, has seen a lot less public expenditure than other areas. And actually, one of the most concerning things is that due to the recession that began in 2014, there was great concern about overspending in the public sphere. And so in 2016, they passed an amendment to the Constitution that said that public expenditures in all areas could not exceed what was expended the year before, plus inflation, for the next 20 years. And there was a small opening to that allowed you to, let's say that you didn't spend as much as you was projected in loans, then you could switch that over to health, or you could switch that over to education. And it was seen as sort of this emergency measure. We have to do this because spending is out of control and we'll never get the budgets underneath. We're borrowing and we'll never be able to get the economy right if we don't put the brakes on now. The problem with that, as I'm sure you can understand, is that giving a 20-year window and affecting specifically very dynamic spending categories such as health and education really shoots Brazil in the foot in terms of its age pyramid, because even though because the population is aging, and so there is obviously a need for more health expenditures. However, the youth population is diminishing, but not diminishing to the same levels as European nations or even the United States. Therefore, there still need to be educational expenditures. And you never know what's coming. Nobody in the world could have imagined, well, the epidemiologists had an idea, but most people didn't ever think that we would be in the situation we are today with this pandemic. And so one of the first things that had to happen before there could be any economic response to the pandemic was they had to pass another amendment that said that all bets are off the table and we don't have to abide by this 20-year ceiling of expenditures, because immediately it became evident that there's absolutely no way that expenditures could stay the same way they were with all of the need, economic, health, and otherwise, that has come out of the pandemic. So yeah, in short, no.
Wow. Okay. So yes, we're approaching the end, unfortunately. Thank you so much. It was great to have you, Professor. I really enjoyed it. Many great comments, and then I would like to ask you if you could, be so kind as to share with us, if you could, your email so that further questions could be addressed. Would that be okay if we shared?
Okay. Do you want me to put it in the chat?
No, we can share it in our group.
Okay.
It's okay.
Excellent.
I was just asking for your permission. And then I would like everyone to open up their cameras so that we can see the faces for a while. What do you think about that? Yes, that's so nice. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Oh, it's so nice seeing people's faces, right? And
Yes.
then I would just like to remind you that this afternoon, in a while at 2 p.m., we're going to have a film club in which we're going to discuss the movie Que Horas Ela Volta.
Oh,
And
excellent. It's going to be
yes,
completely exactly the way that
yes,
it'll
and
fit
then
into everything that I just talked about.
exactly, and that for that picture, I was mentioning that I live behind that aglomerado papagayo. I live in the other side in Sion, so it's exactly the picture that I was going to show in the beginning of the presentations. That picture in Rio, you know, where they have like this very posh neighborhood.
Yes.
In one side, and then there's just this one wall that divides miserable community.
Yeah, I did all of my field work in Rocinha. So I lived in Rocinha for about 3 years.
Wow, amazing. Okay. And then invite everyone to come and participate later at 2 p.m. And of course, in a few minutes, 10:30, right, Marcos, we're going to start our new session on PLA, which is Portuguese as second language. And no, as an additional language, sorry. And so you go grab a mug of coffee and then be right back for our second part of the day. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for hanging on tight throughout this course. The attendance has been great, and people are participating and asking questions and putting their comments on Twitter. They write every day short essays on their
excellent.
So it's a nice feedback that we get from everybody's understanding and participation, and this has been great. So thank you so much, guys. We'll be back in 30, Marcos. 30 minutes? Is that what it is?
Yes, Luciana. We're going to be back in 30 minutes for the Portuguese class.
Thanks again, Professor. See you in a bit.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your week and the rest of your course.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, it's so nice to see you.